In the miniature painting community, there's a big battle between FDM and resin printers. The consensus is that FDM is good for big objects like terrain, where a loss of detail is okay, and resin is for small detailed things like miniatures. I definitely agree. However, I've been more and more into the idea of printing vehicles with FDM because it can be a hassle printing, cleaning, and then curing big resin prints. One of the big issues holding back FDM printing are the noticeable layer lines. I'm going to test a few different methods of making layer lines less noticeable. I made these little 1 by 1.5 inch cards in Blender and printed them out vertically using standard quality to really showcase the layer lines. I'm using a Creality CR10S Pro V2 for this that I've had for a few years now. I haven't had too many problems with it, although I just recently found out you're supposed to replace the nozzle of FDM printers every 3 to 6 months, which explains all the clogging and failures I've been getting lately. Also, I have a 0.4mm nozzle. A lot of the newer printers have 0.2mm nozzles, which, if you're going to be printing miniatures, is definitely the way to go and can produce amazing results. We gotta use what we have, but keep that in mind. The cards were printed in Overture filament, which I've been liking. They have a ton of different colors and kinds of filament. I've added an Amazon link in the description. I'm always open to filament suggestions though, so let me know if there's anything I should try. I wrote all the methods on the back of the cards with a Sharpie so I don't forget which is which, and kept one as a control. Alright, it's time to hopefully get rid of these layer lines. Since PLA has a relatively low melting temperature, I've heard rumors that you can melt the layer lines away with a heat gun. Since most PLA melts at around 200 degrees Celsius, I'd set it to that if you can. The heat gun I have doesn't have the degrees marked on it, so I just set it to whatever felt right and evenly heated the card for 1 minute. I think this is considered science because I timed it. Can a scientist in the comments confirm? Another melting method is using chemicals. The classic one you may have heard about is melting ABS filament with acetone. But since I'm using PLA filament and acetone won't melt PLA, we have to use something called ethyl acetate. Just be careful with this stuff though. The label on the bottle has a phone book of warnings on it. I went into the garage with an organic vapor certified mask on and painted on some ethyl acetate with a brush that I was okay with ruining. I've read somewhere that isopropyl alcohol will melt PLA as well, so I repeated the process brushing on some 99% IPA. Next is sanding. I've seen cosplayers do this to give their printed armor plates a smooth finish. I took a sanding sponge and wet sanded the card. I then repeated the step with a higher grit sanding sponge. The reason you wet sand is to catch all the little plastic particles to avoid making a mess and, worse, breathe them in. Then I sprayed 3 cards in different ways with acrylic spray filler. The first of them got 1 coat of the spray filler. The second card got 2 coats of spray filler. After the first coat, I let it dry, sanded with the high grit block we used before, and then sprayed the second coat of spray filler. On the third card, I sprayed 2 coats of the spray filler, letting it dry between the coats. No sanding or anything else involved. After that test, I used some regular Rust-Oleum spray paint and applied 3 thick coats to it. Normally you want to be light with spray paint to preserve detail, but not today. Applying texture is another method, and you can do this with textured spray paint. You can apply texture with a brush as well. There's a guy on Instagram called Actual Echo who makes some insane kit bashes. One thing he likes doing is adding texture with a mix of Tamiya putty and plastic glue. It creates a really cool surface that hopefully will hide layer lines. Once you make the slurry, take a brush you're ready to dedicate to the cause and stipple it onto the model. I've added a link to his detailed tutorial below. I stippled on liquid green stuff to another card, which I've seen talented creators like Wilhelm Miniatures and Architect do to great effect. And that's all the cards done. It was surprisingly fun testing all these different methods. I sprayed all the test cards with Monument Hobby's new black spray primer, and then lightly sprayed at an outrageous angle with their gray spray primer to hopefully catch any layer lines that were left over and to look sorta cool. If you want some of the spray primer yourself, use the link in the description and code iPaintSmallThings for money off and to help support the channel. Dry brushing is a good way to bring out the layer lines. So the top half of each card got a light dry brushing of white. Alright, and now for the results. This turned out a lot differently than I thought it would. This is the control. Honestly, not too bad, but the layer lines are definitely noticeable. If you don't want to do any of these other techniques, setting the quality to high, and, if possible, having a printer with a 0.2mm nozzle would go a long way. Brushing on ethyl acetate was semi-effective. I think building one of those vapor chamber things would be the best way to go about this and have better results. There are a few of the layer lines that became more noticeable. I'll have to test this more by using the chamber or pooling some acetate in a detailed area. I don't know where I read that IPA works on this stuff, but this didn't do anything. It looks nearly identical to the control. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in 2002 Thomas Jefferson said, "Don't believe everything you hear on the internet." Using the heat gun had interesting results. I can see this working if you set your temperature right and your piece is thicker. But I had a lot of warping on my piece, and the layer lines didn't really disappear very well. In fact, they were almost more noticeable than the control. It could be the warping that caused this. I thought the fill spray tests went pretty well. I don't think one coat of it is enough, but 2 coats had noticeable improvements. This may be my go-to method going forward for a quick technique to get rid of layer lines. Better still was 1 coat of filler, sanding, and then a final layer of filler. The layer lines are basically gone compared to the control, but you'd have to decide if it's worth the extra time and effort to sand. The test with 3 thick coats of regular primer was an improvement over the control, but you might as well just go with the spray filler to save time and paint. 3 thick coats of primer was comparable to 1 regular coat of spray filler. The textured spray paint test did a decent job at making the layer lines less noticeable, not by filling them, but by giving the surface more visual noise to look at. There are different texture sprays with varying intensities of texture in it, like the spray I used in my box terrain video, so this isn't a bad option. I actually really like how the Tamiya putty card turned out. If you look really hard, you can still see layer lines, but it gave a really cool texture that draws your eyes away from the leftover lines. I can see myself doing this on large panels or areas you want to look corroded. Also, you could add a few layers of the putty to make the results look even better. The liquid green stuff did a decent job, but wasn't as intense as the Tamiya putty. You'll need to do more layers than I did to get enough texture to hide the layer lines. Good old sanding did the best by far. The layer lines are non-existent, leaving a smooth surface. You just have to be careful not to sand too much to break through the outer layers and expose the print's infill. Also, I could see this being difficult and tedious to sand around highly detailed areas. But, with that said, This is still the best way to get rid of layer lines and get a perfectly smooth finish out of everything we tested. My favorite results were from sanding, spraying 2 coats of spray filler, and applying Tamiya putty. I think in the future I'll probably start spraying with the filler, sand areas I can get to that I want fully smooth, like flat panels, and then spray again with a final coat of spray filler. Anything I want a different texture for, I'd use the Tamiya putty method, creating a slurry and stippling it on. I'd love to know your thoughts. What do you think worked the best? What technique did I miss? Will the Powder Puff Girls finally defeat Mojo Jojo? What would you have done differently? Let me know in the comments below. I'll try some of these techniques on an actual kit bash, which maybe you'll see one of these days. If there are other methods you've heard of or have had success with, let me know, and maybe if there's enough of them I can do a part 2. Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed, feel free to like and subscribe. And consider supporting me on Patreon, using affiliate links, or getting some comfortable merch. I greatly appreciate everyone who does. Alright, bye-bye.